Rahim. Traditionally, Muslims begin anything that they do that's worth doing. There's a hadith that says anything worth doing should begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is also the actual first statement in the Qur'an. If you open up any Qur'an, the very first thing that will be read is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means in the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate. And Rahman and Rahim are derived from the same root, because Arabic words, and I'm probably going to talk about this a lot over this course of lectures, Arabic words are built on triliteral roots. The Semitic languages are root-based languages, so Hebrew has the same phenomenon. You're dealing with a language in which a semantic field or a constellation of meanings emerges out of primitive root structures, which are based on 3 letters generally, sometimes 4. But the vast majority are 3-lettered, which is interesting in terms of cosmology. 3 is a very interesting number because it introduces the idea of multiplicity. From the 1 came the 2, and from the 2 came myriad forms. So 3 is literally the beginning of multiplicity. And so language by its nature, which is almost inexhaustible, in a sense, and could in reality be considered inexhaustible, is built in the Arabic language on 3. Now, the Qur'an itself is a word which also comes from a root word. And there's some differences about it, but generally, in English it's written like this, and now becoming more popular like this. Generally, the word, the root words here are qa, qaf, ra, and ya. And these are 3 Arabic letters. Qaf is really a letter that probably we don't have an equivalent. It's done in using something in your throat by squeezing the upper portion of your throat together and ejecting this sound qa. Qa. So it almost sounds like a crow. But the second ra is similar to our letter R, ra, and then ya. At its root meaning, you get the word for city, which is interesting because it brings in the idea of civilization. And traditionally, civilizations are built on books. The vast majority of human civilizations, you will find that there is fundamentally a book at the core of the civilization. For the Greek civilization, it would probably be Homer. And in other words, we can't really imagine a Greek civilization without Homer, given what we know about the Greeks. Plato is dependent on Homer. The playwrights are dependent on Homer. For the Hebrew people, it was certainly the Torah, or their Bible. And this will become the foundational book for the Western peoples, the European peoples. The Bible really becomes a foundational book, first in Greek and then in Latin, and ultimately for the English-speaking people, the King James Bible. For the Arabs, interestingly enough, there is no book in the Arabic language until the Qur'an. There's literally no book. They're an ancient people, and yet there is no book in the Arabic language until the Qur'an. Prior to that, the closest thing that you could consider literary was poetry that was done orally. And there were 7 odes that were quite popular that were hung in the Kaaba, in the house in Mecca, and were honored by the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, as being the quintessence of eloquence and of the Arabic art form of poetry. So when the Qur'an comes to these people, this is a radical departure from any previous concepts within the culture of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. The other root that you're going to find in here is the word to recite. Qara'a. And qara'a in the Arabic language means 2 things. it means to read, and it means to recite. So it has an oral and it has a written quality to it. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at, there's a really wonderful book which I recommend, particularly all of you, since you're teachers, if you haven't read it, it's really worth reading, which is called A is for Ox by Barry Sanders. And this book is talking about the fact that orality is the substratum of literacy. If you do not have an oral tradition, you cannot have a literate tradition. And one of his complaints is that our culture is losing its orality. The oral tradition in this culture is dying out because of television and other forms of media in which visualization and not orality becomes the dominant means of raising our children. So if you look at children for the first 5 years of their life, they are oral creatures. They're in the oral world. They're not literate. They're in the oral world. And traditionally what would happen is they would hear stories and their imaginations would be ignited. And this was something that took place in all cultures. Now in this culture is children being raised in front of the television. So the mother is no longer transmitting the oral lore, the childish lore of the culture to these children, but in fact it's being experienced through the medium of visualization, which is a powerful medium, but it has certain effects. And Sanders believes that one of the effects is the lack of humanization, that he believes that orality is a process of humanization. The fact that the Arabs are an oral people is very significant. They're an oral people, and the Qur'an is a Qur'an before it's a book. In other words, the real meaning of Qur'an is the recital. It is the oral book. And the next word that the Qur'an is identified as is kitab, which means book. And kataba, the root word, means to join together. It means to join together. So what happens with the Arabs is that in 570 of the Christian era, a boy is born in Mecca to a mother who his father dies prior to that, during her pregnancy, Amina. And this boy is named Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And during this time, for the first few years of his life, he is sent to the desert, to the oral Arabs, to learn the language through this tradition of the Arabs in raising. The aristocratic Arabs would send their children to the desert Arabs because they considered that they were the most eloquent Arabs. And they wanted the children to absorb the language within the first 5 years of their life, because they recognized that children that were raised amongst these people who spoke a very powerful Arabic would have also strong Arabic, even if they spent the later portion of their life in the city. And so during this time, for the first 40 years of this man's life, really from all, if we look at it just in terms of a human life, very little matters of significance occur in this man's life. By all intents and purposes, one would really say that had the Prophet not reached his 40th year, that he would have been known amongst his people perhaps for one thing only, which was that he was extremely trustworthy. He was a very quiet person. He did not speak much. He did not quote poetry. He was not a poet. He was not known to engage in discourse with the people. He was a contemplative person. He liked to go off and reflect on his own. He was known to be extremely kind to poor people, to orphans. This is all mentioned in the tradition. Other than that, he had no aspirations of being a leader within his people, as some people would. He was from an aristocratic clan, but he happened to be from a grouping within that clan that was on bad times, Bani Hashim. Now, just prior to his 40th lunar year, because the Muslims when they talk about years, they're talking about lunar years, which is about 11 days short of a solar year each year. So his 40th lunar year would probably be about 39 years of age in terms of solar, little less probably. At the age, just before his 40th birthday, he began to see some dreams in the tradition, but he would go off to a mountain just outside of Mecca, which is called Light. And during that time, the word that was used to describe what he was doing was tahannuth. And in Arabic, hin is polytheism. Tahannuth means to avoid polytheism, to avoid idols. So he was going out to this place and he would meditate in this cave. And we really don't have a description of the actual practices that he was doing. But there was a tradition amongst the Arabs called the Hunafa or the Hanif. And these were people who were inclined towards a type of monotheism. They did not worship the idols, they did not believe in the idols, but they did not necessarily speak out against the idols of the Jahili Arabs or the Arabs prior to the Prophet Muhammad's mission. So he would go to this cave, and in the 40th year, in the month of Ramadan, he had an experience. Now there are many ways to look at this experience, and Western Orientalists generally said wretched things about the Prophet. If you read early traditional literature coming out of Europe, just really not very nice things. They've become a lot nicer recently. Since oil was discovered in the Arabian Peninsula, there needs to be diplomacy when we talk about people's beliefs and traditions, when you have interests involved there. So Orientalists have definitely become, and that's a cynical way of looking at it. I think maybe there's been some growth as well within the academic community. And certainly the impetus for attacking Islam prior to that, often based on an almost evangelical type of Christianity that existed, particularly within the Protestants in England, the Anglican Church and others, who really felt it their duty to Christianize the world. There was a very strong ideal that we should civilize the world, and certainly the Arabs need it just like anybody else. And then you have a in the Western tradition of just a type of antagonism between the Islamic forces, because they were world power for centuries, and the Christian forces in Europe. I mean, that tension really, they were coexisting with a lot of tension, with few exceptions in different places, like periods of time in Sicily, for instance, during the time of King Roger of Sicily, where there was a lot of interpenetration going on between the Arabs and the Christians. So in the 40th year, anyway, these Orientalists basically would traditionally say things almost like that he had epileptic fits, this type of thing. The more recent Orientalists, and not just Orientalists, but even theologians like Hans Kuhn wrote an interesting book called Christianity and the World Religions. One of the things he says in there is that we have to stop speaking derogatorily about the Prophet Muhammad, because whatever was taking place there, it was certainly, by all accounts that we have, a sincere phenomenon. In other words, he's not willing to accept, and that's his prerogative, that this was a revelation, but he is willing to accept that the person was sincerely deluded, which is a big difference from simply saying that he was insane or that he was had malintention, right? The experience was basically this. It's come down in the tradition that at the age of 40, he was in the cave and a being came to him. It was in the form of a man. And he said, "Iqra." This was the first word. Iqra. Now, Iqra can be interpreted two ways. It can be interpreted recite or read. Now, the Prophet Muhammad was neither a reciter of poetry, nor could he read. And he said at that point, he said, "Ma ana biqari." I don't know how to recite, or I don't know how to read. It could be interpreted both ways. Generally, it's interpreted that he did not know how to read. Iqra a second time, Iqra a third time, and then in the tradition it says that he was actually squeezed until he thought that his sides would burst. And then he said, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم." And this is the beginning of this phenomenon that will take place for the next 23 years of his life before he dies. The revelation said, read in the name of your Lord, who created the human being from a clinging tissue. Read in the name of your Lord, the most generous, who taught the human being with the pen, and taught the human being that which he did not know. That's not a very eloquent translation, but I'm just doing that directly from the Arabic, and I'm sure the text will have a better interpretation there. At this point, the Prophet was concerned. He did not know what was happening to him. He went down to his wife and explained to her what happened. His wife comforted him, Khadija al-Kubra. She said to him, she was an older woman, and her uncle had been an Arab who converted to Christianity. She was familiar with Revelation. She said, you are a good person. You take care of the orphan. You take care of the widows. You take care of the needy, and I don't think something bad would happen to you like this. Because he thought that this might be like some kind of evil spirit or something. I mean, he did feel that. They go, she takes him to her uncle Waraqa bin Nawfal, who had some knowledge of previous books. And he says a very interesting thing. He said, this is the namus. Now for people that know Greek, namus comes from nomos. Right? And nomos means the law. So in other words, he was saying, this is namus that came to Musa. In other words, you are being given a revelation. That's what this is. And he told him, your people, when they find this out, will become your enemies and drive you from this city. And he said, would they do that? Because he had never done anything wrong to them before that. And he said, they will do that, and I wish that I was a young man, that I might be by your side doing this. Now, during the next period of time, he begins to get these revelations. The next one, Ya ayyuhal muzammiru. Oh, you wrapped, because he used to wrap himself when he would meditate, wrapped in a cloak. And these revelations begin to come with a regularity. Now, the Prophet Muhammad, in a description, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that sometime the revelation came like a bell, like the ringing of a bell, as a vibration, and then it would move into to letters, and then into the actual words. And it's interesting because when you hear, for instance, there's a group of letters that many of the chapters of the Qur'an begin with. 19 chapters in the Qur'an begin with these letters. They're called muqatta'at. And if you hear them recited, they أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم. Now you can hear the vibratory force there. And this is how some of these revelations were beginning, literally like a vibration, moving into the material world from another realm, according to the Muslim tradition. During this time, he began to tell close people. And Khadija is the first person who believes him, his wife, which is interesting. She didn't, abandon him. She was right there and she said, I believe this. His nephew, who was his cousin, who was living in his house, son of his uncle, he was taking care of him, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was a young boy at that time, but he also says that he believes, tells him that he believes in the people from very close people that knew him. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was a very close person. But at a certain point, he's commanded to warn his family. So he gathers them all together. And he says to them, what would you say if I told you that there was a on the other side of the mountains of Mecca waiting to attack you? And they said, we would believe you because you're al-Amin, you're the trustworthy one. And he said, what would you say if I was a messenger of God and I was sent to you? And they said, we don't believe you. And they rejected that. And then, as more people begin to come into Islam, the Quraysh began to get worried. And it's very interesting what they said. They said about the Prophet, they said, "Yusaffihu ahlamana." He makes us look stupid. Because he was saying, do you worship pieces of wood and stone that can't hear or speak or benefit you? And so that bothered them. And there's an interesting analogy in the Qur'an with Ibrahim or Abraham, where there's all these idols that his people worshipped. And one night he goes in, he was only about 12 or 13, he goes in and he smashes all of the idols except for one of them. And he puts the axe in the big one. And then he leaves and they come back and they find all their idols smashed. So they say, this Ibrahim was talking about this. They go get him and they say, "Who did this?" And he said, "Ask the big one." And they said, "What, do you think we're stupid? He can't say anything." And he said, "Then why are you worshiping him?" And then they became self-reflective. Very interesting. They became self-reflective. Suddenly they said, "He's got a point here." Now this became troublesome for them, because at that point a window opens and it can close very quickly, and somebody shouted, "Get rid of him!" Right? And then it becomes a mob scene. Yeah, let's not think about this, let's kill him, right? Now there's an interesting German philosopher, Heidegger, who has a theory about what he calls thrownness. That human beings are thrust into a certain environment, and they literally take on all of these qualities, not based on their own individual reality, but based on what everybody else has told them. And so we learn about the them very quickly. And there are certain expectations within the context of them, the other, like that we don't belch in public, right? I mean, we learn quickly that there are certain things we don't breach. And they're not things that we chose, they're things that are imposed on us. And obviously they have